Okay, well, hello again. My name is Ben Rhodes. I am the Senior Vice President with CAMS, so thank you for joining. Today, we're going to be talking about reserves, and our budget season has just kicked off. So I know everyone on the call is very excited about getting to prepare their budgets. But reserves are a very important part of the budgeting process. So we have Michelle Baldry with us today from Reserve Advisors to run us through all about reserve studies, what you need to know about reserve studies, who to contact during reserve studies, and all the other many things that go along with proper reserve funding. So I do want to remind everybody, we do record these sessions and we do post them to our board member section of the camsmgt.com website. You can find that on the board resources page. So we do have all of our webinars recorded, probably 5 years worth of webinars. So lots of great information if you want to look back at any of the webinars that have been posted. We also have blogs and other great articles. So do encourage you to check out the camsmgt.com board member resources page. If you do have questions along the way, please feel free to type those questions into the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I will read those questions and let Michelle answer those. If it's applicable to the slide, I'll try and interrupt. And if not, we'll wait until the end of the session. So Michelle, I will turn it over to you and thank you again.
Ben, I really appreciate the introduction and appreciate everyone for joining me here this afternoon. The content we're going to be discussing, as Ben mentioned, is reserves and reserve studies. And as you're entering this budget season, I hope your question is not reserve or not to reserve, right? Reserves are integral to the budget, and we're absolutely going to talk about that today. So just a really quick introduction. My name is Michelle Baldry. I'm with Reserve Advisors. I joined Reserve Advisors in 2010 and have been preparing reserve studies and conducting education such as this for 15 years. I am on the board of CAI's Foundation for Community Association Research, or FCAR. That's essentially CAI's sister organization that performs all of the research and best practice reports. So CAI did revise their reserve study standards a few years ago. I was on the committee for that. And FCAR is now updating their best practices report. So heavily involved in CAI. If you have any pain points with reserves or reserve studies, or there's things that you think as an industry we can do to improve them, I'd really appreciate that feedback. So don't hesitate to share it with us. We absolutely want to hear from you to make sure that reserve studies work for ultimately the buyer, you as the board and the community. So with that, we'll jump in. What is a reserve study? So this is truly the definition of the reserve study. And I like to think of it really as a strategic plan, right? It is to maintain all your common area assets. So we're going to anticipate all of those big ticket items, the needs for them. So there's certainly going to be routine maintenance that's incorporated into the operating budget. And then this looks at the long term, the bigger needs that the budget can't really absorb, right? So anticipating these bigger projects, the capital repair and replacement of those common area components, getting them on your radar, and then providing an offsetting funding plan. So how are we going to pay for those? What's the adequate reserve contribution to ensure that we have the funds available for these projects that we're anticipating? CAI, this comes right from CAI standards. It really defines a reserve study as a two-part process. There's the physical evaluation, where we're coming to the community, evaluating all the components, and putting together that expenditure plan, right? What are the needs of the community? What's that 30-year roadmap of anticipated expenditures? And once we've developed that, now how are we going to pay for it? So that's the financial analysis part. Snapshot in time, how much does the association have in reserves today? We've outlined the expenditures. So therefore, what is the future contribution needs for the association? The physical evaluation really has two main parts to it. There's a meeting, kind of a kickoff meeting, an alignment meeting, and then there's the inspection of the community. So what goes on as part of the physical evaluation? When we meet, the reserve specialist would love to hear from you. So we're going to work with, ultimately one person will be the lead. Typically it is the community manager. So they usually are the ones to be that central person to help coordinate and schedule. The reserve specialist will typically reach out to them, schedule a date and time to meet, and then we encourage management companies to invite the board. So we'll ask your community manager if there are key stakeholders that are actively going to use the reserve study. Maybe there's a treasurer that's really involved with it, or maybe you have a finance committee, or maybe it's a pretty big association and you have different groups that all can contribute to it. Maybe there's a recreation committee that oversees the pool. Maybe there's a building and grounds committee, right? Any key stakeholder that actively works to contribute to this strategic plan for your association is helpful to be at that meeting. Because during the meeting, that's where we're really aligning on that strategic plan for your components. We want to understand the scope of responsibility, and what we mean there is what are the association's common components. We want to make sure we're all on the same page with what elements the association is responsible for maintaining. We'd like to know a history of those projects, right? When were your streets last repaved or your townhome roofs replaced? And then we're going to want to review the operating budget. And really what we're doing there is we're looking to see how heavily you fund operationally, right? What sort of maintenance do you have built into the budget? We certainly don't want to underfund reserves. We want to ensure that you have the funds available when you need it, but we also don't want to overfund reserves. So we don't want to include expenses in the reserve study if actually you typically fund those out of the operational account, right? It's more general maintenance. So we try and get that alignment there. We're also going to want to hear from you. What are your concerns? What are your pain points? What's on your mind, right? What's the reason you're engaging with the reserve study? Is it just you're at that time period? CAI recommends updating them every 3 years. Are you at the 3-year mark and you want kind of a refresh? Or are you really focused and concerned with a retaining wall and you need to get that updated, or there's something going on with your pool that you need incorporated in, or you're ready to renovate the clubhouse and you want that captured in the reserve study? What's going on with this association that you want to make sure we know, we address, and incorporate that into the reserve study? That's also a really, really great time to work in new board members. Maybe there's a new board member that doesn't have that historical knowledge of the property, but they want to be more involved. Involve them in that kickoff meeting. It's a good opportunity for them to learn and align too. We really see a lot of benefit of getting that alignment on the front end, making sure that we incorporate it into the reserve study. Then when you receive it, it's that much easier to digest and reflective of really your true needs. So after that meeting, once when we have that alignment, we kind of have our marching orders, we know the scope, we know what elements need to be evaluated, we know what your concerns and pain points are. Then the engineer is going to conduct that actual assessment of those components. So when we say assessment, what is the engineer doing? Well, first they're quantifying everything, right? So they're counting the light poles and fixtures, or they're measuring the streets or the sidewalks, evaluating the playground, really quantifying the components, and then also conducting a condition and life expectancy of those components. And when I say life expectancy, it means what is the typical useful life based on the materials used. Pavement typically replaced or repaved every 15 to 20 years. Asphalt shingle roofs also usually 15 to 20 years. Pool furniture, that's going to vary on the style and the materials, right? Same with perimeter fences. What are the materials that are used? That will adjust the useful life. Now that is still just a typical useful life. What's really going to govern the timing is the condition. So it's common to see streets that are 18 years old and still in fair condition. We're not going to show repaving in 2 years because they're at the end of its useful life, right? We're going to defer the timing based on the condition that we observe. Alternatively, you could have roofs that are only 8 years old and are in terrible condition. We can see all sorts of sheathing deflection, shingle lift, all sorts of issues going on. We are not going to give them another 7 years of life to get them to their typical useful life. The condition really will govern. Now, I think it is important to mention here that while we are trained to do this, certainly at Reserve Advisors, we only hire engineers. So anyone inspecting your property will have an engineering degree and background. We're only there for a day, maybe two, maybe three, depending on the size of the community. You guys live here, breathe here, right? So that's why it's so integral for you to bring any questions, any challenges, anything that you know to that meeting. So it is on our radar and we can make sure that we reflect that. If you've had roof leaks, but you've repaired them or you have this other roof report, we need to know about that, right? It's super helpful for us to review it, evaluate it, and incorporate it into your plan. Now we're also going to look at the manner of replacement. Does it make sense to do this all as one big project? Is it something we should phase, right? Maybe you have miles and miles of streets and the community was built over a period of 10 years and it doesn't make sense to go in and repave all of the streets at one time. Maybe it is something that should be phased, right? So we're going to take those sort of things into account as well. Same with sidewalks. We never see concrete sidewalks all fail at the same time, right? No community's ever had to go in and replace all of their concrete sidewalks at any given time. So based on the condition that we see, the location of trees that cause like roots to kind of upheave the sidewalks, what should that look like, right? Should we have these partial replacements periodically? Is it an older community and you guys really do it kind of annually? What should that look like? And lastly, we're going to look for factors that would affect the replacement cost. An example I like to give here is a retaining wall, right? Maybe it's a little 2-foot retaining wall right against the street, really easy to access, pretty easy project, right? Or maybe it's a retaining wall tucked back behind homes along a conservation area, really large wall, difficult to access, really challenging project to do. Those are going to have very different unit costs, right? Very different projects. So the engineer also has to take those sort of things into account to make sure that it's as accurate as possible. One thing I'd like to mention here, I think it is really important to remember that while we are trained to do this, and this is what we do day in, day out, I like to be completely honest that it is a visual, non-invasive inspection, right? You have one person evaluating a variety of different components from structures to site components to mechanical components and everything in between, right? So it is a visual, non-invasive. And the example I like to give is if you think about going to a doctor, right? We're the general practitioner. You come to us, you do that kind of annual checkup with reserves, typically not quite annual, maybe more like every 3 years, but we're giving you that checkup. When we see things, we have a trained eye to notice this is a concern. We'll flag for you, this is going to need more invasive testing, right? Same with your heart. You need to go to a cardiologist and get this checked out further. So there are some limitations to a reserve study, and I encourage you to ask those sort of questions, and the engineer will be pretty transparent too with the level of detail that we can provide. Example is the pipes, right? Maybe you're responsible for the subsurface utility pipes throughout the community. We can't see those, right? So we can lean on the age and the material and do the best we can to estimate it. But when the community gets to a certain age, it's time to get a more invasive inspection. Give that to the reserve specialist to incorporate into the reserve study.
Michelle, we had a quick question. Who determines what items are actually reservable? If the HOA doesn't have a complete list, where do you go to get it?
Great question. So the reserve specialist, that's our natural background to know what should be a reserve component and what shouldn't, right? So we will rely on you typically as the the community manager or the board to provide us an understanding of what's common area components, right? Do you own the playground, or does the municipality actually own the park? It's actually not the association's responsibility, right? Once when we know, yes, this park is the association's responsibility, that's on us to determine, yep, you're going to need to replace the actual play structure, the benches, or, the mulch is more operational. That's the reserve specialist will do that. However, that's where you can be helpful with this too, and that we want to make sure we have an understanding. Mulch, as an example, typically that's an annual expense, routine maintenance, something that you just kind of supplement and add to, maybe in a landscaping project every year. But potentially you guys treat it like a bigger project, and every 3 years you have 10 playgrounds and you spend $30,000 supplementing your mulch. That would qualify as a reserve expense. So it's really, if it's an annual expense, typically more operational, but the cost usually determines whether or not it should be a reserve component. And we're certainly happy to help you through that. That's our job. But we want you to have some say in that too. So we want to align with you on what really that cutoff or threshold should be. So a general rule of thumb that we use is 1% of the budget. So if your operating budget is $200,000, we'd say a good cutoff is probably $2,000, meaning any expenses below $2,000, general maintenance and operating, any expense above $2,000 qualifies as a reserve component.
Okay.
After we've met with you and kind of walked the property, you showed us your pain points. The engineer did their thorough inspection of the community, quantified all the components. You're free. Your job is done. Those meetings could last anywhere from as quick as 20 minutes if it's really simple and not a lot of complexity there, or it could go multiple hours. We really defer to you on how long you want to spend, and if you want to show us area of concern. Maybe there is something at the playground that you wanted to show us. So we're happy to walk those areas with you first. Then we'll free you of your time. We finish our inspection. Then the engineer goes back to the office, crunches all the numbers, put together the plan of the expenditure plan of the needs. Next step is, how is the association going to pay for it? What's that financial analysis? So we start with the current fund balance. How much does the association have in reserves today, right? How much have you contributed to date? Snapshot in time, how much do you have in reserves? We'll take a look at your budget to understand your current budgeted year contributions. Of course, we never recommend changing mid-year, right? So we're going to plug in what you're currently contributing. So if you did a study, let's say tomorrow, we'd show the 2025 reserve contribution, the remaining amount for the rest of the year. We now know the expenditures. We've laid out the 30-year roadmap of expenditures. So really what we're solving for, that output, is the future reserve contributions. We're offsetting these expenditures. It's really offsetting them by the savings plus future contributions. So that's what we're solving for there. There's a variety of funding strategies. We'll talk through those a little bit. The financial analysis, I think, is easiest described in a graph. I think this graph is super helpful, both for board members as well as individual homeowners, to understand the importance of reserves. So in this graph, the blue line is the reserve balance. The green bars are the reserve contributions, and the red bars are the expenditures. So if reserves didn't exist, there's no such thing as reserves, the whole top half of the graph wouldn't exist. And you'd essentially have to have these fluctuations in the budget, right? Years where now you're doing maybe a somewhat small project, and then years where you have these really big projects. Really difficult for homeowners to financially plan. Certainly difficult for you as a board, management company, to have this instability in the budget, right? It's essentially like special assessments all the time. So the goal of reserves is to gradually contribute to that reserve account, knowing there's going to be years where you're contributing more than you're spending and you're growing that reserve account, and then years where you're spending more than you're contributing and draining that reserve account, which is exactly what we want to do. We don't want you to have all of this money sitting in this bank for this rainy day fund for something that may or may not happen. The intent of reserves is to save the money for when you need it and to spend it. Without a reserve study, it's understandable that a homeowner might see they have $600,000 in the bank, they're looking around, things look pretty good. Why on earth are we still contributing to this reserve account, right? By seeing this graph, they can see, okay, things are pretty good for the next couple of years. We're going to continue to grow that reserve account, but that's because in just 4 or 5 years, we are going to be draining that reserve account. The term that was just added to the standards, this adequate reserves, was added to really help clarify some of the different funding scenarios. Some reserve studies will include multiple funding strategies, full funding reserves, threshold reserves, baseline reserves, a lot of different terms. And ultimately, adequate is the way to describe, in my opinion, what associations should look to achieve. It's a stable, equitable plan that ensures the association has enough money when they need it. So it essentially says you're funding your reserve account to have the funds available when you need to and ensure that you're above zero. You're not going to rely on a special assessment or a bank loan. And we can go into we'll go into the other strategies, but this is in general the concept of the funding plan. So the reserve study process, what does that look like from start to finish? So on the front end is really that discovery phase. So we typically will have a conversation with the community manager or a board member if you are going to take the initiative on it and kind of run the process yourself to understand a rough scope of work. I like to call it kind of the 90%. I pull up an aerial, I take a look, I can see that you have a clubhouse and a pool or 3 playgrounds, and we discuss whether the ponds are your maintenance responsibility, whether the streets are private or public, and we get that fairly tight, that property description. So that's how we're able to put together the proposal. Once when a reserve or a company decides, or I'm sorry, an association decides to move forward with the reserve study, then that's when we start gathering additional information. So that's when we're going to ask for a copy of the budget, the financial statement. We're going to want to understand any current projects that are underway. If you're actively engaged in a project or you're receiving estimates for a project that's planned for next year, we want to start taking a look at that information. And so we'll ask for that right away so that by the time we meet with you on site, we'll have had a chance to review all of that and come prepared to talk through it and make sure that we have an understanding and can create an alignment. Oh, I saw your financial statement. Looks like this is how much we should show as the starting reserve balance. Looks like this is how much is currently contributed. This is a project that's slated for next year. Let's talk through what that looks like, right? So that it's a pretty productive and efficient meeting for all of us. I think I covered the site inspection, what we do there. Next step, we go back, crunch the numbers. We do require our engineers to present the reserve study to our internal quality assurance department. So it's not just one engineer's opinion. You're getting that second, third, fourth set of eyes to really review it and align on it before you receive it. Sometimes you'll hear the word draft, and I'm hesitant to use the word draft because I like to consider it more preliminary because it's complete in nature. We feel very confident in the findings. However, we acknowledge that this is a strategic plan essentially for your association in your community, and it's got to work for you, right? So after you receive it, what that presentation and support and follow-up looks like will vary based on your individual needs. Some communities want to, as soon as they receive it, they want us to give an overview of it. We're happy to do that. Some prefer to digest it on their own. They want to review it, talk about it amongst themselves, and then come to us with questions. We are happy to tailor that experience to whatever works best for your association. And we can align on some of that up front too, right? In that kickoff meeting, what do you want that post-study support to look like? And you do have a revisionary period for that reserve study. So I encourage you to review it, ask questions of us, right? Make sure that we're all aligned on things. And then we can revise the study based on your comments and suggestions and reissue it. Now, I do have to caveat here that we do have, there's standards we have to adhere to ethically and to maintain our designation through CAI, the Reserve Specialist designation. So if you came to us and said, well, we are responsible for the roofs, but we don't want to fund for them, so remove them, we'd have to explain why that's something we can't do, right? But if you want to change the timing, maybe you're responsible for painting the townhomes, and we had it phased over 3 years and you want to phase it over 2 years or over 5 years, those are the sort of changes we're happy to make. Or you want to defer a project slightly a year or two, we can work with you on that to come up with a plan that's executable for you. And then you'll also receive an Excel file. So this is when you're in that kind of preliminary stage, you can kind of play with the numbers too, explore these alternate scenarios before deciding on the finalization of the study. But once when you're kind of all in agreement, we will finalize the study. I truly see reserve studies as a service, not a product. So I don't want you to think your reserve study is this binder or this PDF document. It should be something that you're living, breathing, utilizing, and certainly this time of year as we enter the budget season, right? So if you have any questions along the way, our reserve studies are all inclusive. So we're not going to bill you hourly to jump on a quick call to answer some questions you have. Or if you're wondering, can we defer this project, or we want to accelerate this project, what would that look like? Can we do that? That's all included in the cost of the reserve study. So if at any time there are questions, I strongly, strongly encourage you to reach out, and we're happy to be a resource for you. So I tried to weave examples into the presentation, but wanted to quickly cover some kind of typical components or get people thinking about kind of typical components for communities. So in the first picture, streets. If your streets are private streets, there's going to be repaving. If they're more parking area type streets, there's probably going to be seal coating, curb and gutter potentially. The catch basins where all the stormwater or the rain runoff goes, those will require capital repairs. Sidewalks, of course, landscaping can be something that associations sometimes want included, so that also can be included as a reserve expense. Looking at the kind of multi-story building, facade of the building, of course. Sometimes windows and doors are included, sometimes they're homeowner, but certainly the roof, the facade, there's balconies, entrance doors. There's going to be quite a bit of mechanical equipment there. There's going to be lobby renovations, maybe a meeting room, fitness room, all kinds of components there, potentially a parking garage. The more traditional townhome, of course, the roof, gutters and downspouts, siding, brick veneer. That's one that's sometimes underestimated. That should be included as a reserve expense. The concrete walkways, potentially entrance stoops, all of the wood supports, those will eventually require replacement and some substantial repairs when you're going through paint finish cycles. Playground, we touched on that one. That equipment will need to be replaced. The surface likely will need to be replaced. Sometimes there's a border, site furnishings, maybe trash receptacles, benches, maybe a gazebo in the background. Pool, a lot of components associated with the pool. Of course, there's the plaster finish, the tile and coping, there's the deck, mechanical equipment, fence, all sorts of expenses, furniture associated with that pool. And this is all to kind of paint the picture. This is on us, right? You tell us, yes, I'm responsible for the pool. We determine what those reserve expenses should be. Same with the playground, right? Or the buildings. We get an understanding of what you're responsible for. We'll help you strategically determine what those projects should be to maintain those components. So I wanted to include a slide with some less common components or things that people don't think of as much. I think the other ones were a little bit more straightforward. But ponds, people don't realize how expensive it is to maintain ponds. There's typically sediment removal, maybe erosion control. There's structures associated with those ponds. So a lot of capital repairs, in addition to just the periodic maintenance that will need to be performed for the ponds. Plumbing, that's something that certainly for a brand new community, not on the radar for associations, but when they get to a certain age, that will fail too, right? So certainly something we need to make sure that we're incorporating when they get to that age. Retaining walls, sometimes people just, you see them there, but you don't really realize that, oh yeah, those will eventually fail, or we need to periodically inspect these and perform some repairs to them. And then same with irrigation, right? That eventually will fail too. And then there's in between that, there's probably pumps and controllers and things like that that need to be taken into account. So again, this is all just to show you tell us what the components are, or what's, I shouldn't say components, you tell us what the maintenance responsibilities are, we'll determine what the needs are. This is a question we get quite a bit, or used to anyway. What's the minimum amount we should have in reserves? How much do we need to have in reserves? Old rule of thumb was 10% of the budget. If you have 10% of the budget in reserves, you're fine. The truth is, we wouldn't be in business. There wouldn't be a reserve study if it was that simple, right? Everyone would just put in 10% of the budget. There really can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. It's really, really customized based on the age of the community. What are your how much is the association truly responsible for? What are your maintenance practices? How aggressive are you with preventative maintenance versus more reactive and things fail and need to be replaced prematurely? There's a lot of factors that go into it. So it's not as easy as just saying a magical number. Even in the kickoff meeting, even once we see your financials, we have to do the full evaluation, really crunch the numbers, run the expenditure plan, and then the supporting funding plan. So this is a really, really unique example that I love to share because it's such, it's really rare. CAI actually is going to probably incorporate this into some of their publications because it's so rare to have this opportunity where we had the ability to do reserve studies for two identical condominium buildings. We're calling them Condo East and Condo West, exactly the same. We did the reserve studies at the same year, back in 2012. They were both in very similar condition, a lot of deferred maintenance, and both struggling financially. Neither had funded reserves properly. Condo East took our recommendations and really followed them. We helped them with a plan. We said, okay, you're going to have to increase dues 60%. We recommend you reallocate some of these expenses back to the owner, take the burden off the association, let homeowners decide when they want to replace their windows or how they're going to maintain their balconies, right? Remove that from the association. And they followed it. They followed our recommendations. They were able to replace the roof. They replaced the boiler system. It was a multi-story building. They were able to update their interior. So they renovated their lobby and hallways, renovated their amenities. They were able to do all of these projects they needed to do or should have done to help maintain the community. This is all I should have mentioned. Fast forward 10 years later, we updated both reserve studies 10 years later. At that time, the recommended reserve contribution for Condo East, the one that had followed the recommendations, was $380 per unit per month. And we only had to recommend 2.5% increases over the 5-year period. So essentially inflation, right? They had a stable, well-funded reserve. Condo West was paralyzed. They didn't take our recommendations. They only increased dues by under 5%. So they essentially were keeping up with inflation. But that was it. They kept ownership of the windows, doors, and balconies. When we updated 10 years later, they did not replace the roof. their roof had now dated back to 1998 and was going to cost more than 40% more than what East had paid. And keep in mind, this case study was just from a couple years ago because it was 2012 to 2022. So in that period, the roof is now 24 years old. They're continuing to have all of these leaks, and they're going to have to pay substantially more than what East had paid. They did replace their boiler because they had to. They needed building heat, but they had to do it through a special assessment, and they hadn't renovated their interiors. With all of this deferred maintenance and not catching reserves up, that compounds over time, right? So fast forward 10 years later, which unfortunately comes all too quick, as we know, time flies, their new contributions are $920 a month. And on top of that, that was just the starting point. We were still going to have to phase them an increase of 25% over the next 5 years to get them to where they needed to be. So this is all to say, the longer you wait to make these increases, it continues to compound. So I encourage you to do everything you can, bring us in, let us be the bad guys. We'll fall on the sword and explain why this is a must. We have no skin in the game. We don't do roof projects or any of these other things, right? It's truly independent third party suggestion on the most proactive way to maintain your community. So I'm happy to share this with you too. We have a white paper on it. It's a 2-page more in depth, if helpful for any of your associations. If you guys want to share it with membership, especially if you're struggling with increasing dues, just let me know, because unfortunately we're seeing deferred maintenance doesn't go away. It just gets worse. That kind of segues into legislation, right? Unfortunately, the Surfside collapse in Florida, I don't think anyone ever anticipated that. We knew that there was deferred maintenance throughout our country, but never anticipated a building actually failing. And that's really started the conversation about requiring reserves more. So there were the states in blue had already had requirements for reserve studies, and some had funding requirements as well. The dark green have statutory guidance for reserves. The light green have no requirements, so they do not require reserves at all. And then the orange are states that have changed since Surfside. So after the collapse, Florida, of course, introduced stronger legislation. Tennessee did, Maryland did, New Jersey did. I was just checking CAI's website, and there's a handful of other states now, New York, Massachusetts, quite a few, Connecticut, that are all considering legislation around reserves. The Carolinas do not have a requirement for reserve studies or reserve funding. There is statutory guidance in North Carolina, and South Carolina is silent on it. So not a requirement, but certainly a best practice. CAI recommends preparing reserve studies and updating them every 3 years. They're also in support now of mandating reserves. So historically, they did not support legislation requiring reserves and reserves funding, but the LACs now, or legislative action committees, do now support it. We've seen it be really successful in some of these states. We have a pretty big presence in Florida, Maryland, and we've seen positive impacts from this. Of course, there's the stories in the news about how it's hurting the condo markets because they're unable to afford it. But I had a conversation with Don Bauman, the CEO of CAI, and this is unfortunately the temporary pain for the long gain, right? The associations now, we're all living in this toughest time for some of these associations that have deferred the maintenance. If you are in an aging community and you're kind of in that boat, I encourage you to really collaborate with your reserve specialist so that we can help you get on track sooner than later. Some of the lessons from Surfside, really, even if legislation isn't in your states, which it's not in South Carolina and North Carolina, there's a lot of people that are looking at reserves much more closer than they were previously. So historically, occasionally an insurance broker would tell me that their carrier wants to see their reserve study. Now every broker I talk to says that their carriers are asking for copies of the reserve study. Lending is getting tighter around it. Of course, FHA, Fannie Freddie, they're monitoring reserves and looking for safety and structural wellness in kind of critical projects. Um, but it's even on the individual home mortgage as well. And I would say that's certainly not as common, but from time to time, we will get a call from a lender or from a realtor, and they'll say they have a potential buyer and they want to see a copy of the reserve study. Now, we, of course, aren't going to release reserve studies to realtors, but in that instance, we kind of coordinate with the association to make sure they have everything they need from us. Of course, properly funding reserves will help property values, right? If you have the funds available, you're able to perform these projects on a timely basis, not have all that deferred maintenance. So it not only costs less money if you're able to execute it well early on, as opposed to deferring it. It, of course, helps the aesthetics, right? The curb appeal of the community. And then lastly, we're seeing a real cultural shift. For a long time, the mentality was to kind of suppress dues, right? Let's keep dues low. We were doing a great job as a board if dues were flat, if we didn't have to increase. But we have to prioritize this because, like I said, it doesn't go away. Deferred maintenance isn't an option anymore. We need to ensure that we are properly planning for these projects instead of cutting corners. So I mentioned this before, CAI did revise the reserve study standards. So these are kind of just covering right now the trends in reserve studies. Post Surfside, they really wanted to ensure that reserve specialists are taking into account preventative maintenance. So reserve specialists are starting to ask the question, are you performing preventative maintenance on your clubhouse HVAC system or whatever the component may be? And if the answer is no, that useful life has to be diminished because we know it's not going to last as long as it should if you're not maintaining it. And that we need to make sure that you have the funds available for the reality of it, right? So that is now supposed to be documented in the reserve study, and useful life decreased. See, I also wanted to make sure that reserve specialists are identifying building inspections in the reserve study. So, clubhouse or traditional townhome, not really required to do a robust structural inspection. This is more for the mid-rise, high-rise properties, but we should be incorporating full structural inspections for those type of properties as a reserve expense. And then long live components. So similar to how I mentioned plumbing earlier as something that maybe isn't included for a brand new community, it's on reserve specialists to make sure that we are disclosing that, right? So educate the homeowners and the board that this is something you're responsible for. It has, an X, maybe 60, 70-year useful life. So we don't think you're going to need to fund for it just yet. However, you should know that this is essentially a liability as the community ages that will work into the reserve study, and you'll need to start funding for that. So those were the big changes to the standards. And then, like I mentioned, the best practice report, so how providers should be preparing reserve study, how they should interpret the standards, and then also how users, so how board members should be reading and implementing the reserve study. So that guide is free. I'm always happy to send it. It's on FCAR's website. But that will be revised to reflect these new standards. So any and all pain points you have with reserve studies, I'd really, really appreciate hearing those so that we can make sure that those get reflected in the best practices guide. I wanted to quickly touch on the funding goals. I promise to go back to this. Some providers will show multiple funding strategies. I'll be completely honest, at Reserve Advisors, we just show threshold. It can be kind of confusing when there's multiple shown, and it almost creates this sense of maybe not doing the right thing if you're not taking the biggest increase, right? Or fully funding reserves. We think fully funding reserves, the full funding strategy is ultra conservative. Essentially, what that means is you are funding for each component individually. So at any given time, you have all of the funds readily available for that component. So if you used 8/20ths of your roof, you have that much. You've used 6/10ths of your plaster finish of your pool, you have that much accrued. And so you have this really large pot of money, as you can see. The threshold is kind of that Goldilocks. The baseline assumes you're going to go to zero, right? There is no cushion, no threshold there. We are burning reserves right to the $0 mark. A little aggressive, especially due to this not being a crystal ball, right? It's a plan, but we know needs will change. Costs aren't going to be right down to the nickel of what we planned. So you want a little bit of flexibility there. And so that's where this threshold is really that kind of Goldilocks, where it provides a little bit of a cushion or a factor of safety for the reserve account without having a surplus of a ton of funds available when you're not necessarily going to need them. So it's kind of that sweet spot, in my opinion. If you wanted alternate funding strategies, we certainly can show that. We can show you all three funding scenarios if you'd like. We just hesitate to do that automatically because we don't want you to feel like you're doing the wrong thing by following threshold funding. That truly, in our opinion, is that sweet spot of funding. So you have the reserve study done, you've worked with your reserve specialist, you are confident and comfortable with the plan in place. Now what do, right? If best practice is to update it every 3 years, what really should you be doing during that 3-year period? As you're entering into the budget season, how should you be utilizing your reserve study? Well, it's important to remember the reserve study is really that budgeting tool, right? It identified near-term and long-term needs of the community. So snapshot in time, we anticipate these projects to occur over the next few years. You should probably focus here and just know these long-term items, they're being funded for, but you don't have to worry about them just yet, right? So as you're entering the next fiscal year, what projects were slated for that year? Do we want to tackle crack repair at the streets? Or you know what, maybe they're holding up better than we thought they were going to. We're going to defer that 1 year. Maybe there were projects you deferred last year or this year that you didn't get to. Let's make sure those are taken into account too, right? So what is the plan? What do we want to execute on next year? This is a great starting point to make that determination. In our narratives, we will also provide some recommendations there on the criticality of the project. Essentially, how critical is it? How much of a priority should it be? If we think this is still okay, can we defer it? Or is it something that we should really have professionally evaluated before we decide to defer that project? Then, of course, you want to use the reserve study to understand the funding, right? That's the ideal reserve contribution, the adequate funding level, if you will, what was recommended in the reserve study. So that's best practice. Now, if for whatever reason the association elects not to fund at that level, well, what is your plan? Right? I think it's important to make sure you're communicating that to homeowners. Really, we should be contributing $60,000 or $80,000. We're only going to contribute $40,000. This is what this means. We should all be prepared for a special assessment of X amount of dollars, or we're going to have to take out a bank loan when these projects come online, right? Make sure that owners are aware of what the impacts are of not properly or adequately funding that reserve account. So in summary, make sure you understand your reserve study. no matter who prepared it, please don't let it be a binder or a PDF that is just a static document that you never look at and you just kind of do every 3 years to check the box. Make sure you understand it, you align it, ask questions of us. We're happy to attend a board meeting, a special meeting, just to talk to the reserve study, whatever the case may be, to make sure that you're comfortable and confident in understanding it and interpreting it to the homeowners. Keep it current. It is a plan, but all plans change, right? So as you decide to defer a project or want to accelerate a project, just track those actuals. You can copy paste and move those expenditures right along, and that'll flow right over to the funding plan, right? If we decide to accelerate our clubhouse renovations, what does that look like financially? Do we have a shortfall? Can we absorb it to move it up ahead? Use it to help kind of explore these scenarios. And then, of course, make sure that you're updating regularly. Like I've said a few times, CAI recommends 3 years, really by 5. That's kind of the backstop. You should make sure you're doing it there. But of course, anytime in between, if there have been drastic changes, maybe a year of really bad freeze thaw. It was a harsh winter. Pavement was kind of beaten up, worse than we anticipated. Maybe you're not going to get that full useful life. We should pavement out in 12 years, but it's looking pretty bad. You'd want to bring us back out or at least do a non-site update, a financial update where we can rerun those figures for you. Because again, the sooner you start catching up on this, the better off you are. The longer you wait, the more it compounds and you'll have to have more drastic increases. So along those ways, I take these calls all the time. Yep, that's changed. Okay, nope, that looks fine. I'll document it in our notes so the engineers are ready for the next update. But it's fairly small in the scheme of things. You don't need to update. Or, oh, wow, okay, you had an insurance claim, some hail damage. Yep, this is a pretty big change. We should update the reserve study, even if you're at the 2 year mark, right? So happy to have those calls and walk through your specific scenario to help you kind of align on next steps. And that is the whole presentation today. I hope there's lots of questions
We
because
do have a lot of questions, so I will start
awesome.
asking. So, first question has to do with inflation. You mentioned inflation about 2.5%, but how do you adjust inflation? How do you recommend reserving for inflation? Is there a number that you're using over the many years with it changing as it has?
Great question. And you're right, it's a 30-year study. We know there's going to be times of really high inflation, like we experienced a few years ago, and years of really low inflation. So the reserve study will use a more normalized rate. Even when we had very high inflation, we were going up on near-term projects to account for that inflation, but we didn't want to use this really high inflation rate because we knew that wasn't going to last for 30 years and it blows the numbers out of the water. So yes, inflation should be included in your reserve study, more of a normalized rate, plus or minus 3%. We always hover around there depending, we evaluate trends and things and maybe go down to 2% sometimes and up to 3.5%, but in that range.
Okay, a couple of questions around cost. What does it cost to get a reserve study done?
Great question. The reserve study cost is really based on the time required to complete the reserve study. So very simple community, call it, let's say 30 homes, one little private street, some fences, maybe a gazebo, a couple $1,000s. Master plan, big community, clubhouse, pools, tennis courts could be as much as maybe $10,000. But realistically, an average reserve study price, call it $4,000, but it is community specific based on the maintenance responsibilities.
Okay, this may be a me question, but I'll ask you. Have you seen communities use grant funding to cover the cost of a reserve study, particularly smaller communities that may not have a lot of funding? If so, what grants have you used?
I have not seen that. I'll be honest. The state of Maryland introduced a bill because they now require reserve funding. They introduced a bill and legislation to allow grants, but there haven't been any grants available. So unfortunately, to my knowledge, I don't know of any grants for associations at this time.
And so I'll say in North Carolina, I can't speak to South Carolina, the larger municipalities, so Charlotte, Raleigh, do have some neighborhood matching grants that might help offset cost of reserve studies. I'm not as familiar with some of the smaller municipalities, and I can't speak to South Carolina municipalities, but that is definitely something to check out. Some of the managers or regional vice presidents may be able to help you get some more information on that.
Wonderful.
Um, how many years is good enough to have in the reserve? So I'm guessing how many years should it go out? You said 30. Should it go less? Should it go more? But your recommendation is 30.
Yeah, the standards used to say 20, but in reality, everyone was going out to 30, or most were going out to 30 anyway. And we determined 30 as that sweet spot. You certainly could go out further, but that's where inflation starts to kind of drive things, right? You don't want to necessarily start funding for a second or third roof replacement or repaving, right? It gets difficult to predict, and the numbers kind of inflation starts to carry it. So 30 years is that sweet spot where you're going to capture most of the big ticket items, or if you're doing them regularly, those will work in. So you'll have a full 30 years to fund for those projects, while balancing not overfunding for things that are too far out.
Okay, I think you mentioned this, but the question has to do with how do you estimate insurance cost? Is that not an engineering task?
If it's for insurable value, that is not in the reserve study. Now, certainly something like a gazebo or a playground, that's replacement. But if it's a clubhouse, it's going to show replacement of the various components, not the overall value of the clubhouse. Because ideally, you're not doing that through reserves, right? You're never going to have to completely replace the clubhouse. What we have a separate department that does property valuations for it. It's an insurance appraisal. So if that's what you're looking for, that is a separate service, but certainly something we can provide by someone credentialed to do appraisals. So it's kind of a different arm.
So I know you mentioned this and you said it would put you out of business, but what is a good rule of thumb for how much you should have in your reserve balance?
Did you listen to the presentation at all?
So,
Fortunately, it really does vary. I could say that threshold where we're saying have a balance there, a cushion. That is where this is a bit of an art, not a science. And it really kind of depends on the extent of how critical, how many projects you have going on. But we like to give, let's just say there's $1 million of expenses. We'd want to probably keep 100,000 or so as a cushion. So the lowest mark would be 1,000, but that's not to say, or 100,000. That's not to say right now you'd have 100,000, because if you like are going to spend 1 million in 5 years from now, I sure hope you have a lot more than 100,000.
so what tools do you use to help determine life and cost estimate?
Yeah, great question. So there certainly are tools available, Marshall, Swift, there's CostWorks, there's programs that you can um, purchase to give estimates for costs. That being said, it can't take into account some of the things like we spoke about, right? What is the complexity of the project, that retaining wall project as an example, or the size and scope? Is it one small street or miles and miles of pavement? Those programs aren't very good at that. And that's honestly, we have an internal database to refine our costs. And that's one of the benefits. We prepare over 4,000 reserve studies a year. So as we're working with communities, they're giving us these bids for projects that they're currently doing, and we're taking those into account. So you're getting that localized. This is what we're seeing in your area for X project.
Okay, what about reserves in a declarant transitioning community where some items have been reserved and some items maybe have not been installed yet? And how do we plan for future reserves that will be needed?
Question. And that's when I'm happy to jump on a call with you specifically and walk through where you're at in that process. Some associations that are building really fast, it makes sense to go ahead and put those future components, maybe an additional playground or a pool. We can measure them from plans. You tell us when they're going to be done. They're going to be done, next year. We can incorporate those in. If it's a really big association and you're going to be building over the next 10 years, you don't want to start funding or putting funds away for something that's 6, 7, 8 years out. So we would recommend then snapshot in time. What do you have today? Let's get that on the radar and then update regularly as phases or sections are built to work those into the plan. So I hate to say it's not a one size fits all, but it is, my recommendation would vary based on kind of the size of the property and how quickly it's being built.
Okay, does it make sense to seal coat roads in a neighborhood, and do you factor seal coating in a reserve study?
Typically not, unless they're like townhome or parking areas, then we will because the fluids, you're parking there and there's fluids there. But when they're just regular streets and people are parking in their driveways, usually it's not cost effective. It might look better, right? Because ideally you are crack sealing. So as you're seeing cracks, we work that into the crack repair and patch so that you're not getting further deterioration. But then maybe it doesn't look pretty. So if you want to seal coat the streets for a more cohesive look, that is certainly your discretion, and we're happy to show that. But it's not going, a traditional seal coat won't necessarily extend the life of traditional streets.
Okay. We did a reserve study in 2017 when the builder turned over the community. We have a pool, clubhouse, lake. We've used a reserve study, which is great. Thank you. But we found that a lot of the cost estimates are way off. Do we need another reserve study completed, or should we just get some estimates updated to provide for the current study?
You definitely should update your reserve study. Yeah, it's not surprising at all that the costs are off because they're 8 years old, right? No one predicted COVID, inflation that we experienced. So we saw a lot of communities, even if their study was done in 2019, they were updating, 2020, 2021, 2022, because just the market went up. Costs just surged, right? And they wanted to catch up with that as soon as they can. So, or could. So I strongly recommend updating. Plus, it's time now to have another condition assessment. It's been 8 years. So in addition to cost changing, the conditions probably changed as well. So it's time for a refresh.
Okay, I will say it is 5:30. We can keep going, Michelle, if you have some time. We have 22 questions waiting. But if you do need to drop off, we thank you for your attendance. But I will go for another 15-ish minutes and answer as many questions as we possibly can. So, are there
Happy to.
best okay, are there best practices in adjusting for risk adjusting future reserve expenses so as not to cover under or overfunded reserves? For instance, a roof may be good for 25 years or only last 15 years and replacement may be $30,000 to $60,000. What about surprise items? Is there insurance data that helps inform what we think about including? Lots
Uh,
to unpack there.
Yeah, see, that's a lot to unpack. And certainly there are variables, and that's why CAI recommends updating every 3 years, right? You could get a 15-year roof, you could get a 25-year roof. The the weather, we can't predict what's going to happen climate wise to affect the condition of the components. So updating regularly will help kind of keep that current, but you don't want to get to where you're modeling 18 different scenarios and then it just becomes overwhelming. So you work with the best available information at that time for the plan, and then you regularly update the plan to account for current costs and current condition.
Okay, this may not be a you question, but how do you reallocate ownership of certain items in the reserve? For example, windows and doors or underground utilities.
Yeah, so we wouldn't be the professional to help you through that, but we essentially what we did in that scenario is we explained, hey, this is the liability associated with this component, right? Your windows are going to cost $2 million. So then they work with their attorney reviewing their legal documents to determine how they go about that, right? Because the documents ultimately govern how you can operate your community. So you'd have to work with an attorney to understand what sort of vote and what that looks like for your community for that to legally happen. And then as far as to municipalities, you probably could speak better than this or to this than me, Ben. But my understanding is sometimes we'll take pond streets, that becomes a negotiation. We are not the person, we can tell you what it's going to cost to maintain it. So on the reverse side, when they're public streets and they maybe want to gate them and take them over, we can run an analysis and say, this is what it would cost if you take over ownership of this so that you have an understanding of that. But the legal way to go about that is beyond our area of expertise.
Okay, also maybe a me question, but I'll ask you first. Is there legislation being considered for North Carolina for reserve study requirements?
Didn't see that when I checked the most recent post from CAI, but if you're aware of anything.
Currently, the legislation that is being updated or at least proposed at the moment, nothing is pending regarding reserve studies. That doesn't mean something can't be slipped in, but everything that I've seen does not include a reserve study requirement. I think you said so. Our HOA insurance is a factor in the premium for reserve. I missed that statement, so maybe I'll skip that question. But in the condo example, if the annual dues are raised by 60%, homeowners aren't going to hold you guys responsible because it's ultimately up to the board. I think you referenced the two condos with an increase of 60%.
Yeah, you're right. And if I implied that they would hold us responsible, I didn't intend to. What I intended to, I think, explain is we can come into membership and talk through the why. This is the overall needs of your community. This is why you should really phase or ramp up your contributions so that you're not continuing to defer maintenance. So we want to help and support you through that. Was the intent I was trying to communicate there.
And I follow up to the question I was confused by, but it looks like the HOA insurance and what the insurance covers factors into the reserve study components in the reserve study pricing.
Um, if I'm understanding, I think are we looking at the insurance coverages? And not necessarily, but those typically somewhat would overlap because you're insuring for the common components and we're evaluating the common components. So we're not using the insurance as a backstop per se, like we're doing our own assessment. So we're not looking to see, like, if we have an entrance monument or you have an entrance monument, we're not necessarily looking at your insurance to see if you're insuring for the monument, but there probably is some overlap there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So our CC&Rs limit regular assessments to 10% increases per year. Other than special assessments annually, how do we get to the threshold financing?
So that would be one of those, we could try the 10% and see how long, like depending on how underfunded you are, see what that looks like, how far out you'd have to go. Or it does become a conversation with ownership, right? Like we should all vote and we really should be contributing, we're going to need to increase it 25% or whatever the number may be. And so we'll help support you, try and get membership vote to do that. But we do understand sometimes you are kind of bound by your documents.
Okay, I might answer this question, but should monthly dues be raised by a certain percentage each year, whether or not reserves are adequate?
Costs go up for everything, right? Like life costs go up. So your insurance is going to go up. Your management fees are probably going to go up. Your landscaping is going to go up, just like you want an increase in salary or your price of bread is going to go up, right? Like it, so yes, but that,
I,
I
I
mean,
I will also say we did a webinar on the top 10 mistakes that board members make. And one of the attorneys that was hosting the webinar said not raising your dues annually. So he said that's the top 10 mistakes, and that is just to keep up with inflation because it's always going up. I think it's gone down once, maybe if I'm remembering correctly, but every year it's always going up.
that 1 through 9 on that top 10 list, Ben.
Probably another one is not getting a reserve study, but is it typical or recommended to share the study with your residents?
A great question. Um, so in my opinion, sharing information is helpful. The whole report might be overwhelming for the average homeowner. So there are pieces of it. Like typically a reserve study will have an executive summary that has all the high level detail or that graph. I think that's a great financial picture of the association's finances and what your needs are and what kind of, your plan looks like. But then certainly any department heads, like I said, if you have building and grounds committee or finance committee, they should have access to the full report. Um, but I think some transparency is good, and we typically defer to the community manager and board on how much you want to share, but we don't restrict it, if that makes sense.
So does a board have a fiduciary duty to do a reserve study?
I mean, they have a fiduciary duty to maintain the property values of the community. And in order to do that, a key component of that is a reserve study. So it's not necessarily a hard requirement, but it certainly helps you perform that duty. And you can inform the homeowners. Maybe you are in that 10% camp. You really should be contributing 15%. You can now communicate. You've done your fiduciary duty to explain to the homeowners this is what we need to properly or adequately fund reserves. This is what our documents allow. We should all be prepared for a short. This is what this means. We're going to need a special assessment or a loan if we don't change this trajectory. So we understand that you are sometimes limited in there, but I think the transparency to the homeowners and that buy-in or at least understanding of the plan certainly benefits you as a board member.
Yep. So this next question, you basically just answered it, but how do you convince a board that keeps dues lows and does not want to change the assessment, change their attitude towards better planning? So, but I'll say one thing that I say, a homeowner association is just like a person. You go through the development cycle, and that's like your parents send you off to college. You get out of college, you want everything, you have nothing, but you always are told to start planning, right? Planning for your retirement. Your reserves are your retirement savings, and if you aren't saving for retirement, you're going to be in trouble when you need the money. And so it's just trying to get people to plan like you would plan your daily life. But
Completely agree.
is it recommended to invest reserve funds, I guess, in investments to offset inflation?
And there's actually a guide on that, and I think it's called the GAP report, and I believe it was just revised after the reserve study standards were revised, and I believe it's free of charge too. Now, why invest? It's more CDs, right? Evaluate how much we're anticipating your funds to accumulate to, right? And so if you don't have a lot of near-term expenses, yeah, certainly. Um, put some of that money in a CD where you're going to obtain a little bit higher of an interest rate. Don't go to Vegas and put it on the roulette table or in the stock market. That is not your money to be gambling. But you can certainly invest in money markets or something that has a little bit higher interest rate.
Okay, we have a reserve study from Reserve Advisors. I believe I heard the minimum cost of an item to include is $2,000. So the minimum cost of an associate, to include in the reserve study was $2,000. Did I hear correctly? Our report states that amount is $7,500.
Oh, I'm glad you're clarifying that. So the general rule of thumb that we'll use is 1% of the budget. So the example I gave was $2,000. I said if you have a $200,000 budget, we would set that cutoff at 2,000. So my guess is that you have a budget of around $750,000. So we set that cutoff at $7,500, and then should have itemized those expenses that we deemed to be that are under that sometimes could go either way. So and the intent there is really to get these projects on your radar. If you're going to have to maybe replace a motor in an irrigation pump, right? That might be listed there. So that's like, oh, well, actually, we'd rather put that in reserves, right? So that becomes the starting point. And you can let us know if you want to move things into reserves or if there's anything in reserves that you want to lower out and say, actually, that we treat this more like general maintenance. Let's put that in the operational.
Okay, this is a tough question because it comes up a lot. How do you justify funding reserves 30 years out when the majority of the homeowners are at retirement age?
That's one where we get quite a bit too. And it really comes down to that fiduciary duty, right? What is, even if you're saying you won't be around in 30 years, what are you going to do with that unit, right? You're ultimately maybe giving it to someone, you want them to get their most out of their property value. You don't want to allow the property to start deferring maintenance because they don't have the funds available. Buyers are becoming more savvy. It will impact property values, and ultimately is really the proper way to run an association is to plan for these future needs. But
Yep.
I
And
know it's easier said than done sometimes.
easier said than done. I did have a community private everything, but their water lines started to fail, and these were old copper or not copper. It was the water lines and the sewer lines. They were terracotta sewer
Terracotta.
lines, and
Yeah.
they were collapsing. And it's an older community with a lot of older individuals that were living in the community, and they had very minimal reserve funding or reserve, yeah, funds, and we had to start special assessing, and it was unfortunate because a lot of the people are on fixed incomes. So,
That's what
but
we
yeah,
always say
very.
too, right? I mean, if you can't afford the extra $10, $30 a month, you're certainly not going to be able to afford the $6,000 special assessment. So, um, where it feels hard initially, it's much more manageable than these big looming special assessments.
Okay, I'm scrolling through some of the open questions. North Carolina HOA borrow against HOA reserves to add new capital improvements? If so, how long should the loan period be? And if so, should interest and competitive rates be included in the payback of HOA reserves?
I'm hearing or understanding this correctly. Essentially, you want to add a capital improvement, but you want to build a new dog park, and you're asking to take a loan from your own reserve account. So, one, kudos to you for the question, the way you worded it, because yes, you can't just fund this new amenity or whatever the component is out of reserve account. Those funds are earmarked for the existing components. However, if you do want to borrow from yourself and treat it like a loan, that is something that we can reflect in the study as long as your documents. And we encourage you in this instance really to work with your community manager and an attorney to understand legally what you can do there. But you're absolutely right. It is essentially taking a loan from yourself. So you document it. We can work with you to say, yeah, you can absorb 100,000 or whatever the case may be based on where your critical year is. And then you develop that payback period. We really don't recommend going beyond 5 years, like pay it back fairly quickly. And as far as interest, I mean, you could incorporate the normal interest and inflation that the reserve study has. It's not a bad practice.
But I will say yes, you can do it in the state of North Carolina, but it is document specific. And so you'd want to make sure, like you said, check with your attorney, make sure that you know it's legal based on your documents. But then it's also should be part of your budget ratification process for North Carolina. So you want to make sure that you disclose it to the membership and you go through the proper process of saying that this is how it's going to be funded. But we definitely can help work through that. But
Comment, Ben, and just to quickly add on, we can reflect that in the study too. So we can show it basically, show a decrease where we're showing the expense. This is the new component you're adding, and then we would show it as a payback period, a new like an additional reserve contribution to pay yourself back. So you could partner with us too to make sure that it's accurately reflected in your plan.
okay, well, I went 18 minutes over, and I know that there may be a few additional questions, but I do want to cut it off. So, thank you, Michelle, for your time. Last question was, what's our next topic? So we do these webinars the third Thursday of every month. I'm hoping, I said last time, our next one would be on trees. I do have an arborist that is wanting to come in and do a session with us, but I need to get that scheduled. So I'm thinking it will be with an arborist on trees, but it may change. So, but again, thank you. Thank you for sticking with us, those of you that are left, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So, Michelle, good night.
Thank you. Appreciate the thoughtful questions. Hope everyone has a wonderful night.
Thank you.